You're alive.
This is the Senate Transportation Committee. We are here to talk about state transportation revenues and what other states are doing. We have testimony from a number of people that are on Zoom. And I think our first is from Ash. And I think Jim Timon.
Yes.
What?
I'll need to jump out at 5.
And Jim, I'm Rich Westman. I'm the chair of the committee. I'll just have people go around the table. How about starting with you, Pat?
Sure. I'm Pat Brennan, Senator from Grand Isle County.
I'm Andrew Perchik, Senator from Washington District, which is mostly Washington County.
Senator.
Oh, you don't want to, okay. And hi, I'm Rebecca White and I'm from the Windsor County District.
And Wendy Harrison with Windham County.
And we thank you very much for being here. I think you've been in touch with our staff person, Megan. And if you could, we're very interested in what other states are doing and what's going on at the federal level. So if you could help us understand what's going on in other places in the country.
Well, great. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be able to speak with you this morning. A little bit about what we're seeing in other states when it comes to transportation funding and transportation revenue. My name is Jim Timon. I'm the executive director of the American Association for State Highway and Transportation Officials. We are essentially the trade association that represents all 52 state departments of transportation across the country. So our board is limited to just the directors from each of the 52 states. You have to explain when I say 52 because we only have 50 states, but we also represent the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. In addition to doing typical Washington, D.C. trade association work where we represent the state DOT point of view with Congress and with the administration, we also provide a platform for the state DOTs to be able to come together and exchange best practices and to be able to gather information from our members on issues like this one, where we really work closely with our members through different committees and councils that we have to collect information on how states are collecting revenue within their state borders and how they're using that revenue in order to invest in transportation. We are a 110-year-old organization. We've been around for that long. We are multimodal in that we represent not just on the highway side, we also work on public transportation, on aviation, on water transportation issues, active transportation issues, biking and ped, rail issues as well. Like I said, we work closely with the administration and with other organizations here in DC in order to make sure the state DOT perspective is represented in policy decisions that are made. So I do have a handful of slides. Can I share my screen? Will you all be able to see that if
Yes, we will.
All right, give me a second here to get that in place. Okay. So when we talk about transportation investment at the state level, what we see is a wide variety of approaches across states. Most states use a variable rate state fuel tax. Some are now taxing electric vehicles through a registration fee. There are states that have sales tax or on vehicle sales, leases, and rentals. Some utilize general fund revenue, and some utilize have a dedicated portion of sales tax revenue. There are really over 100 different sources of funding for highways and bridges across all of the different states. So this here is a map that shows the different states that have a variable rate state fuel tax. There are about half of the states, I think about 24 in total. There are several different ways that state utilize a variable rate tax. Some states tie it to a consumer price index. There's about 10 states that do that, essentially alter the tax rate based on what CPI shows every year. Some it's based on the average wholesale price of fuel. Again, there's about 10 states that do it that way. And then there are 3 states that do it based on either a national or a local highway construction cost index. So, for example, North Carolina does it based on a combination of things. They use CPI as well as changes in population within the state. Georgia does it based on fuel economy and CPI. And Maryland uses a combination of things, including CPI as well. And then most recently, we've seen Minnesota make the decision to index their gas tax based on the highway construction cost index. For electric vehicle registration fees, we've seen a big increase in recent years in this area. Again, about 39 states have an electric vehicle fee that they charge. These are usually annual fees that are registration fees, and those fees range for passenger vehicles from $50 a year up to roughly $300 a year. 11 of those states have indexed those fees to grow over time based on a variety of factors. And 4 of those states have a sliding scale based on the vehicle class or the weight of the vehicle. On this slide here, you see that there are roughly half of the states, or 26 states, that have a sales tax on vehicle sales, leases, or rentals, and dedicate that tax to infrastructure investment. And in this slide, you'll see.
We do have a question.
Can I ask a question on sales, lease, and rentals? So like New Hampshire does not a sales tax, but they have an ad valorem tax.
Oh, yeah.
So I didn't know, is New Hampshire the only one that does that, where they,
The only one that does it for vehicle sales?
well, they have it on, not on the sales, but on the value of the vehicle
It's yearly.
every year.
And they dedicate that to infrastructure investment as opposed to just having that as a general tax.
That's my understanding, yeah.
I do know that Virginia has a similar tax, but it isn't dedicated to infrastructure. I'd have to look to see if the tax in New Hampshire is the only one in the country that works that way. I don't know.
Okay. All right, thanks.
For general revenue states, there's about 35 states that use a portion of their general fund revenue and invest it in transportation. And there are about 13 states that utilize a portion of sales tax revenue at the state level and dedicate that to transportation. Other areas where we're seeing state and localities look for additional revenue are displayed here on this slide. We have 18 states and the District of Columbia that have fees on transportation network companies. So this is Uber and Lyft. They're assessing a tax there. There are 2 states that have a fee for retail delivery. We're seeing more and more states show some interest in this situation. So think of your Amazon deliveries having a fee tacked on top of that. And then obviously there are states that are using tolling or local or regional taxes as well and dedicating those to infrastructure. One of the more interesting areas are states and localities that utilize what we call sin taxes and dedicate those towards infrastructure. So taxes on alcohol or tobacco or Sports betting. We're seeing some more states look at sports betting as taxes or fees on sports betting as a source of revenue and dedicating that to transportation as well. It's important to note that this isn't it's not just states that are struggling with revenue sources for transportation. The federal government is in a similar situation. You'll recall that 3 years ago, Congress and the White House were able to pass a landmark piece of infrastructure legislation, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, largest funding bill for infrastructure that the country has ever had, provided roughly almost $600 billion over 5 years for infrastructure. Now, traditionally at the federal level, these programs are funded by the Highway Trust Fund, and the Highway Trust Fund is primarily funded through the federal gas tax. Well, the gas tax has not been keeping up with the funding levels that have been authorized because it hasn't been increased in nearly 30 years. So Congress has had to look for other sources of revenue, predominantly from the general fund, to subsidize the Federal Highway Trust Fund to keep it from going insolvent. Since 2021, Congress has spent more from the Highway Trust Fund than revenue that's been collected on a year-over-year basis. And since 2008, Congress has transferred $275 billion from general funds to the Highway Trust Fund in order to keep it solvent and be able to support the level of federal funding that we see across these programs. For this bill alone, Congress had to transfer $118 billion from the general fund to the Highway Trust Fund in order to be able to support the funding levels here. So this is not just a challenge that states are facing. The feds are facing it as well. And honestly, the feds really haven't done anything on the tax side in close to 30 years. So the hole keeps getting bigger year over year on the federal side when it comes to revenue that's dedicated for transportation. One of the other challenges that the transportation industry is facing is the cost of construction. You'll see here on this slide that there's been a 70% increase in highway construction costs over the last 4 or 5 years. So from October of 2020 to June 2024, there's been a 70% increase in the cost for a typical highway construction project. So as a result, we've seen a loss of purchasing power that we're getting from the federal dollar and from the state dollar. So when you think about the investments that are in IIJA, the federal program has really lost about $60 billion of value in what they had hoped to invest based on this 70% increase in the construction cost index that we've seen over the last 4 to 5 years. This figure here, again, at the federal level, shows the impact of the construction cost inflation over time. Again, going back to the figure 2022, you'll see that the amount of money that's authorized at the federal level for highway programs starts out at about $72 billion a year and goes up to roughly 80. But when you adjust that for inflation, you're actually losing money over time because the rate of increase at the federal level is just not keeping up with what we're seeing at the rate of inflation for construction materials and for overall for construction projects at the national level. This table here demonstrates the imbalance that we're seeing at the federal level with the Federal Highway Trust Fund and the cash shortfall that we have. As you can see here, we are running in the negative. We're barely able to keep up with the projected outlays that we have. And then you'll see in the future, really starting in 2028, even with the additional deposits from the general fund that Congress has made in the past, if there's not a new influx of revenue into the Federal Highway Trust Fund, either through the general fund or an increase in revenue sources dedicated to the Highway Trust Fund, such as the gas tax, will start to run in the negative in 2028 and beyond. I'd mentioned that we've had transfers up to $275 billion over the last, I guess it's been like almost 20 years now, 18 years since 2028. You'll see that in this slide here. And then again, another chart here that shows kind of the cash flows and balances for the Highway Trust Fund and us running into the negative starting in 2028. So in order to, as we look forward at the federal level, again, the IIJA was really a historical achievement for the federal government to be able to come up with the funding levels that they had. In order to be able to continue those funding levels moving forward, we'll need to have roughly $143 billion in additional Highway Trust Fund revenue to continue at the current levels, and then to also continue a unique budgetary scheme that they used in IIJA, where they authorized advance appropriations of general fund dollars to support some IIJA funding. And we would need roughly $200 billion from the general fund to support those programs moving forward. So in total, the federal government's going to need another $338 billion on top of existing Highway Trust Fund receipts in order to do a bill in 2027 that is similar to IIJA and the level of funding that they had there. Some of the areas that Congress could consider when looking at this, and again, these are areas that states also consider. They could increase the current Highway Trust Fund user fees, so the gas tax, the fees on fuel, on trucks, on tires. They could look at new revenue sources, or they could cut funding from the Highway Trust Fund, essentially scope down the federal programs and the spending levels down to a level that is consistent with the revenue that's coming in. They could also continue what they've done for the last 18 years and transfer money from the general fund, or provide additional funding over and above the Highway Trust Fund just through the general appropriations process. One of the things that we've done as an organization is essentially come up with a matrix of different revenue options. And you'll see here that we list roughly 20 different revenue options. The yields that you see here are at the federal level. But again, a lot of these options are also available for states to consider as well. And again, they range from your traditional revenue sources, such as a tax on gasoline or diesel, to ones that are a little bit more unique, such as taxes on freight bills, or a ton per mile charge on freight for trucks. Some of these things are not enacted within individual states, but these are options for states to take a look at, or for the federal government to take a look at as they deal with the revenue challenges that they're having in supporting the level of investment that they need to do with their infrastructure systems. This slide is just a little bit of the priorities that we're working on as an association on behalf of the state DOTs here in Washington. As I mentioned, the IIJA is set to expire in 2026, so we're working hard to make sure that Congress knows what the state DOT priorities are. We want to make sure that it's a priority for Congress and the administration to reduce some of the regulatory burden out there and streamline project delivery. We think that makes those dollars go farther. We also have a handful of other ones here that I'll leave for you to read on your own, not necessarily connected directly to revenue sources. But with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have that AASHTO could help with. Thank you.
Questions from the committee?
No, helpful.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive in. I was wondering if we could go back to the delivery fee section, and if you could give us more details on that. I introduced in S75, which is also known as Kurt's bill, creating a unified resilient transportation system, a delivery fee within that, because it was identified by the governor's funding study as one of the options. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to what happened throughout the legislative process, if you know, with those other two states, would that have a delivery fee, what states those are, any details you have would be helpful for me.
Sure. So this is a relatively new option for states to consider. So the two states that I have here that do a retail delivery fee are Minnesota, and they most recently did it in 2023, and then Colorado, which I believe did it in 2021. So those are the two states that we have on here that have instituted a fee on retail delivery. Again, the thought process here is, as I'm sure that you're aware, is with the increase in delivery truck traffic that we've seen with the growth of Amazon and other e-commerce platforms, that this is a viable user fee, really, right? We're seeing more of this type of truck traffic in these areas, so it's a way for us to assess a fee for use of the system for delivery of these products with just the explosion in growth that we've seen from e-commerce platforms.
Now, in those states, is the delivery fee, are there exemptions for it? My understanding is, and maybe this is a very specific question, so I'm happy to follow up offline, but my understanding with one of the states is that there is an exemption for medication, kind of the stuff that, you know, is a necessity. I'm wondering if you have any information on that, or
I do not offhand, but I know that we could find that out for the record, or I'm not sure if my colleague who's going to speak here after me might have more information on that from the
yes. If I may interject, thanks, Jim. Doug with NCSO, and I'm going to present next. With Senator White, we know the sponsors of both the bills in Minnesota and Colorado, so we can connect you with them. We're based in Colorado, so we have some firsthand knowledge of what happened in Colorado, but we're very familiar. We work closely with both of the bill sponsors. My colleague Matt will go into quite a bit more detail about the structure of both the delivery fees. They do differ quite significantly, and there are some trade-offs with that, but I'll let Matt just speak to that when he gets to his presentation, if you could, and I think he will be able to answer the bulk of your questions at that time.
you know, that's amazing. I'm gonna hold back then.
Perfect.
And nice to see you, Doug. We met
Nice to see you, Senator White.
Be nice to have that information. So Jim, I'm interested in the timetable in 26 around what the feds might do. Historically, they've been pretty good about not cutting states for infrastructure and increasing funding for infrastructure. And in that timeline, a lot of that infrastructure requires matching funds, so it requires us to build up. When do you think in this process, and I know the world has totally changed, and you know, when do you think we would have some idea of in the timetable what the thinking is coming out of Washington on infrastructure funding for transportation?
So that is a great question. And a month ago, I would have answered it differently. I would have told you that Congress traditionally does not get this bill done on time. And with the expiration being September 30th of 2026, that we should expect this to go into late 2026 or 2027 before we get a bill from Congress that
Yeah.
reauthorizes the federal level.
My question in that would, because we've got, an increased bump up, would that mean that if they punted and they said, would we get lower amounts for a year? Would they freeze this? The whole, I don't know. We don't know what to think.
So what we found out from speaking with members of Congress over the last month or so is that the Congress really wants to accelerate the process for this bill. They would like to actually have a draft House bill and a draft Senate bill sometime this summer or early fall. So that will give us the first indications of what funding levels both the House and the Senate are considering almost a year out before the current bill expires. And really there's motivation for Republicans to try to get this done in that time frame because the midterm elections are in 2026. If Republicans have control of the House and the Senate and the White House, and they want to get this bill done, this might be their window in order to get it done before the midterm elections. So indications from the House and the Senate are they do want to try to get something done before the midterm election. And in order to do that, they want to get their draft bills out there this summer or early fall. And when we see those draft bills, we'll get a sense for, are they looking to cut funding for transportation or are they looking to keep it level or increase it?
That's great. We're in a place where our legislative session is usually from January to the end of May each year. We, in January of a year from now, will be looking to construct a budget, and we would be expected to make match. So that all, it would be helpful for us if we knew by the end of this calendar year, or at least had some direction about what the possibilities are.
I think we will have some information at that point. I will also say, even if the overall funding level for the bill decreases, the amount that state DOTs get, and in this instance for VTrans, it may stay the same. It may grow. There was a big growth in this bill that went towards programs that are discretionary, where the administration kind of picks which projects they want to fund. The formula funding that goes to the states that they count on year to year, that has, there was like a 20% bump in that first year, but after that, it has only been an increase of, by inflation, like 2 to 3% a year.
Yeah, when our inflation has been much higher than that.
Exactly.
Yes.
Senator from Washington.
Thanks for the presentation. And just to confirm, the budget bill that the House passed, I think yesterday, the day before, that didn't have any transportation funding or cuts in it. They're just going to hold that all off for the multi-year transportation bill. Is that right? Just to confirm.
That is correct. As it relates to the IIJA transportation funding sources, yes, the reconciliation bill did not rescind funding from that bill.
Okay, or any other transportation funds?
Not that I'm aware of in other transportation programs. No, I don't.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Broadly, I'm wondering if you could speak to how you're seeing other states respond to the pausing of transportation funding from the federal government at this point. What are other states doing? Are they coming up with plans? What would you recommend in this very uncertain moment?
So,
Trump administration, just to be clear,
Yes.
Donald Trump wasn't president who's doing this.
yeah, so there, for some programs, there has essentially been a pause in federal funding where states are not being able to be reimbursed for the work that they've done. They're not being able to advance planning documents. They're not being able to advance some environmental reviews. Our hope is that this is really just a bump in the road with the new administration, where they are really learning how the different programs work, and that we should see all of this stuff start to free up here very shortly. We are in constant communication with the administration, letting them know how this is impacting states on the ground, trying to provide specific examples so that it's not abstract for them. So giving them examples of a bridge on I-95 in Connecticut that's ready to go to the next phase of the procurement process. And if we don't get sign off from USDOT to be able to move forward, won't be able to let that project or go to that next phase of the project. For a lot of states, including in Vermont, right, your construction season isn't as long as, say, a Texas or a Florida. So you need to make sure that those decisions are made when they're supposed to be made. We don't want to risk losing a construction season based on uncertainty of federal funding being released. We are communicating that to the administration, trying to do a little bit of education on how these decisions that are being made inside the Beltway are impacting states out across the country, and trying to use specific examples of that. I would say also making sure that your elected members of Congress are aware of the impacts or potential impacts that this might happen. The administration is being very responsive to members of Congress as well that raise these concerns. But again, we're seeing this impact across all the states. Right now, there's an extra step in the process that's happening with planning documents that's really causing some states to not be able to make amendments to their STIP. If you're not able to make those amendments to add projects to that, you won't be able to use federal funds to advance those projects. That process typically is a very simple and quick process. It's taking longer now for those to be able to move forward. So we're trying to work with the administration to find out where the choke points are and try to accelerate some of these pauses that we're seeing, or some of these kind of transitional hiccups that we're seeing in the process. But you're not alone in Vermont. We're seeing it across the country.
Okay, so when would you say we should transition our strategy? Like when are you as an organization going to say, hey, actually, states, you need to start coming up with this on your own? Like, is it a month? Is it a week? Like, what is it? 6 months? Like, when in your view should we transition strategies?
I think that's going to vary state by state. I mean, you guys have a shorter construction season. You are more dependent on timely approval of these projects and these planning documents. If you lose a month, you have risk pushing a project potentially into another construction season. So it's very reasonable for states in the Northeast or in the northern part of the country to, I would think, start to panic in the next month if we don't see a change in direction here. The administration has said that this is temporary, that this is just their opportunity to look at policies across the board to make sure they line up with what the president wants to do, and that this is something that happens in every administration. We certainly see that in administration changes in areas like discretionary grants, but this is the first time we've seen it really on formula grants and kind of standard procedural approvals that have become kind of the norm. We usually don't see an interruption in those processes like we're seeing right now.
Yeah, this feels already like a 5-alarm fire. So I guess I'll wait a month before I panic.
Any other questions for Jim? I have one last question. Your presentation particularly when it deals with other states, deals specifically with what's happened in those states. And we've got, for example, Senator White asked about the retail delivery fees. Are there any other things that you know that are being considered in states that haven't made it to the level of a state has put something in place?
So I think that the presentation does a good job of capturing the range of different options that states are considering. I'm not aware of options that are not presented here that are on the table now, but I do think that there are additional states that are considering some of these options that maybe are not reflected on this list at this point.
Okay, that's great. That's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I did not mention in the beginning, but VTrans is a great member for us. They're a leader in a lot of areas where, as we bring states together to exchange best practices, it's great to have them at the table to be able to talk about some of the great things that are happening in Vermont. So thank you.
And so I have one last question. It's Kevin Marshall working for you?
He is actually, and
And when did that happen?
it happened about a year ago. Look, we try to bring the best and the brightest from across the country into our organization, and we were very lucky to bring Kevin in as our director of engineering, and really leveraging his experience with VTrans over his career. And another example, we're bringing great ideas from Vermont to the entire country.
I will deny it if you repeat this to him, but he's a pretty bright guy, and I always thought he was pretty good.
Well, this morning, right before I walked in here to do this, he had mentioned that he's interacted with you in the past, and that he said I shouldn't be nervous.
Yeah, he's interacted a little with me in the past. Okay, do you have one more?
No,
Okay.
except extreme terror for our funding, but that's just.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I think we have two from NCSL, and the question is, who's going first?
That would be me, Chair. Thank you very much for having me. Sorry. What the heck? Doug Schinkel. I'm having problems with my camera, actually. Not there. I am. Hello. Good morning. How's everyone doing there in Vermont?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me.
The weather, so.
Well, very good. It's helpful for me to go after AASHTO. Jim provided a lot of good information. We do have a decent amount of duplication in our presentation, but we were kind of listening in keenly. And so myself and my colleague Matt Wicks will kind of piggyback on some of what he said, but we will add some further detail to some of the policies that he suggested. So my name is Douglas Schinkel. I am the Transportation Program Director at the National Conference of State Legislatures, NCSL. And as probably all of you know, NCSL is a membership organization comprised of all 50 state legislatures and the territorial legislatures, and all 7,000 plus state lawmakers across the country, as well as the 30,000 plus legislative staff that serve them and help keep legislatures running, are all members and entitled to our services. So we're here to serve you and to provide this kind of information like we are today, and looking forward to the discussion. Our headquarters is based in Denver, but I did want to kind of touch briefly, I would say maybe perhaps almost thankfully at the moment, we focus on state policy, and we let our colleagues in our DC, NCSL's DC office concentrate on our federal state work. But I will mention that we work very closely with AASHTO, and we're in communication about many of the matters that Jim spoke about during his presentation. And there is quite a bit of alignment, I think, for the most part, between NCSL and AASHTO and some of the other groups that play a big part in helping shape and influence the federal transportation package. NCSL has been pretty influential and successful in the past in helping shape some of these packages and getting specific provisions added or tweaking things and what have you. Of course, we're not fans of unfunded mandates or things that don't really ask for consultation from the states about the best way to do things. Another example is Real ID, who administers and gives out driver's licenses. That's states. It's not the federal government. So to the degree possible that they consult us in those sort of situations makes sense. Before I get into my presentation, one other thing I want to just quickly mention, and thank you again, Chairman, and nice to see everyone, is that NCSL does have a transportation committee, and I did just check. We had Representative Coffey, who was involved in one of our partnership kind of thing, partnerships on funding that we had done before. But she's of course left the legislature. But we don't currently have any members from Vermont on our NCSL transportation committee. So if that is of interest, I will send you an email with some language. And essentially what you need to do is ask your presiding officer, Senate president in your chamber, and I'll give you some kind of boilerplate language to use, and you can just suggest a few people and ask for approval, and then those people can be added. And it can be lawmakers and legislative staff, although the legislative staff, we would need to ask the legislative director. I say this because that committee, one of its functions is it helps inform our lobbying efforts in DC in terms of what our priorities are. And we don't really have a lot of representation from some of the New England states at the moment. So that would actually be particularly strategically helpful for us. So if that is of interest, I can send that message along to the committee staff and then convey that, and you guys can get back to us if you are interested in having some folks added. So I wanted to make sure
If you could send that to Megan, we'll definitely take a look at it. And I think we do have members that would be interested. I personally would be interested. So I will say to you, I think it was a loss when Representative Coffey decided not to come back to us. But I will definitely take a look.
I appreciate that. So we will make sure that we revise that language and get that over to you quickly, hopefully today or tomorrow, to get that process going. And yeah, I really appreciate this on a personal level, working with Representative Coffey. She was a very pleasant person. But we've had good engagement from Vermont over the years. I know that Senator White and Representative Pooch were at our legislative summit last year, as well as probably some other folks. And we'll get into that later, our big meetings in Boston later this year. So we hope to have you there, and we'll have quite a bit of transportation programming. So I want to make sure, I address what we're all here to talk about today. So let me share my presentation. I think I'm going to have to back up quite a few slides. Can you all see that presentation?
Yes. Oh,
Okay. And there we are. And once again, I'm going to present about the first 15, 16 slides, and I'll transition to my colleague, Matt, and he'll kind of get us over across the finishing line. So let's go in. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but I do think it is worth talking about some of the dynamics that are kind of underpinning why states and the federal government, but I'm going to focus on states, are in kind of a tough road ahead with regards to transportation revenue. And I think this slide is one of the most helpful and illustrative ways of it, is that states traditionally have been the most reliant on motor fuel taxes, gas taxes, to pay for their transportation systems and programs. But because of the proliferation of electric vehicles, but probably more especially because of the increasing fuel efficiency of the American vehicle fleet, whether that be passenger or commercial, what we have seen, and this slide from the National Association of State Budget Officers lays this out nicely, is that you see in 2016 that motor fuel taxes were responsible for about, on average, 41.1% of state transportation revenue. This does not include federal here. 41.1% in 2016. You fast forward 8 years, and that has declined all the way to 35.9%. That's a pretty significant drop in just 8 years. And you ask what has happened. There was, of course, the downturn in driving during the pandemic, but that has largely returned. And really what this is once again, there are some vehicles that just simply do not purchase fuel anymore, and there are other vehicles that purchase less fuel. And so what you've seen instead is that some states are really bumping up the other category quite a bit, which Jim spoke to and we'll talk to some, and the other is really a potpourri. Some things are non-transportation related at all. Some of them are, sales taxes, hotel fees, other things. Some of them are kind of tangentially transportation related, but the real kind of pressing issue for states, especially states that are more reliant on the motor fuel tax, is that this problem is going to likely get worse and worse. So this is another slide. I don't want to spend a lot of detail, and I know it's a little fuzzy, but really the point of this slide is that and this is from a group that we work with, the Libertarian Leaning Reason Foundation, and they have some good info just kind of on what long-term might look like. And the yellow line critically is that if there's no change in our current miles per gallon of our American vehicle fleet, that's what we would expect our state and federal fuel tax revenue to look like going, from 2020 through 2050. And then those blue, green, and red lines are a demonstration of varying predictions of EV adoption rates and how they would impact the overall state and federal fuel tax revenue. And what you see is that by 2030, a gap of around 19 billion already nationwide already coming into place, and then getting worse and worse. And once again, this doesn't even include the fact that it doesn't completely include just the increasing fuel efficiency. Jim spoke to this, is probably, quite frankly, probably more well-read on this. But I think the other piece that, of course, is important is that, the federal gas tax has not been raised since 1993. And furthermore, inflation has just, outstrode the gas tax for a long period of time, meaning that the purchasing power of the gas tax has dwindled considerably, 80% since 1993, when the federal gas tax was last increased. This is the last, I think the last slide that I have kind of on like what the overall trends are out there. And this just shows you the actual trends in gasoline and fuel purchases. And I think this is really important. Once again, you'll see the green, the top line is the overall amount of gasoline sold in the country, and the projections for the future. And the projections are that that's going to start to go down year over year. And what I will tell you is Matt and I, from kind of looking, and Jim, I'm sure, has very good insight on this too. What we're seeing is that in most states, their motor fuel tax revenue is already steady or declining. There are some exceptions, states that are fast growing, have population growth, etc. But for the most part, and this is even given that some states have increased their gas tax recently, that in most states, their motor fuel tax revenue is kind of stationary or is already declining, and that is likely to only get worse. So interestingly, and we like to always share this slide, is like, where does Vermont fit in? What do your peer states look like in terms of how reliant you are on the motor fuel tax? Well, with respect to this slide, you all look like you're actually in, quite good shape. You're less reliant on the motor fuel tax than other states are. Just in general, remember that 36% number, that's kind of the average. And with your kind of peer nearby states, you're doing pretty well. Connecticut's pretty similar, but you see, New Hampshire is much more reliant on the motor fuel tax. And these numbers are, once again, from the National Association of State Budget Officers. So I'm going to transition now, get into just talking about what states have done. I apologize. I'll try and go quickly over some of the pieces that Jim already discussed. So the first thing I'll talk about is state gas tax changes. I will say that, since 2013, 34 states and DC have increased their gas taxes. And as Jim, referenced, many states do have indexed or variable rate gas taxes. I think what's key with those index taxes is that the pro is that they allow you to then not have to go back every couple of years and raise the gas tax, which we very much understand, elected officials don't probably necessarily want to do. And they just let this work. Now, they all usually have some sort of ceiling. It's not like the gas tax is going to go up. If inflation's high, the gas tax is not going to go up 5 or 6 cents. Usually the increase is not more than a cent or two at most. What I will tell you is that I have heard an increasing reluctance from lawmakers, and this honestly really started about 10 years ago, where lawmakers were more and more reluctant to raise the gas tax because they don't see that as a credible long-term source. I don't want to say credible, but that it's like the erosion of it is making it more difficult to justify raising it. And so that has kind of made folks look to some other alternatives. Now, this slide, you may say, geez, Doug, this is a lot of bullet points, but this is really to demonstrate that states have really have wide-ranging sources to pay for their transportation systems. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of these bullet points that I list on here are a big source of funding. Some of them are only used in a couple states, but it shows that states have been creative for a while and have been getting more creative of late to do so. some of these are very contingent on a particular state, like there are oil and severance taxes and things like that. If you're a state like Wyoming or Texas, you're in the unique position of that you can use those oil and gas severance taxes to generate revenue for your transportation system, and you don't have to be as reliant on the motor fuel tax. But not every state has that option. Another interesting option I'll just mention real quick is Georgia put in a $3 per night hotel fee, and that money goes to transportation purposes. Kind of has a user fee connection because someone using a hotel is more likely to be like a tourist or someone, you know, traveling on the interstate system or local roads. But I will just leave that there, and we're happy, you know, if any of these options kind of pique your interest. I do want to talk a little bit, go in a little bit more depth. You know, Jim spoke about state electric vehicle and plug-in hybrid fees. So interestingly, what we've seen is that, you know, there's been quite the acceleration with this, is that in that now 39 of the 50 states have these fees. And like Jim said, the fees range from $50 to about $290. There's 22 states that have a plug-in hybrid fee. Those ranges are a little bit lower. We are aware of quite a few more states that are looking, kind of the states that have not implemented such a fee, to add one this year, and then also some to go back in and index or raise it. Critically, I will say that from my perspective, the pros and cons with this, with a state EV or plug-in hybrid registration fee that is on top of the traditional registration fee, right? And I know that Vermont has these, is that the pro is that this is incredibly easy to administer. This is very easy from a kind of staff and cost effective perspective to implement and administer this. So not much cost to collect it, very easy. The con side, of course, is that this is not tracked with the use at all. And that's something that we hear from people a lot, is that, you know, and we actually hear this from lawmakers too, that they hear this from the constituents. The research shows, and this may change over time, that electric vehicle drivers actually tend to drive quite a bit less than people that own internal combustion engines. So there's like kind of an inherent kind of unfairness with a kind of flat fee, but at the same time, you know, you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and this is a very good way to bring some revenue into your transportation system quickly. So I'm going to talk about road usage charges a little bit, and I'm assuming you all are mostly familiar with the concept. I know that Vermont passed some legislation back in 2023, and the hope was maybe to start some sort of pilot system in 2025 that may get pushed back. But, you know, in essence, of course, a road usage charge is, rather than charging for the fuel you're using, you're charging based on their actual usage of the roadway. And critically, I think that, you know, in a vacuum, this would be the ideal user fee for a transportation system, for a driving system. But of course, there are many questions about how to administer such a system and collect those. And I'll get into those a little bit. But the critical piece to understand is that there are 4 states with voluntary RUC programs that already exist: Oregon, Utah, and Virginia. Their programs have been operational for a little bit, and Hawaii's is coming online this summer in July 2025. So here's just some baseline information about Oregon, Utah, and Virginia systems. What I will say is they were all created by state legislatures. They are all voluntary at this time. They all allow someone who enrolls in these programs to then not pay, or only pay up to the upper level of the EV or hybrid fee in some cases that they would pay. This is because these programs are not, and you know, sometimes I get questions like, how much money are these programs collecting right now? The simple question is not much or nothing, or they're in the red. The purpose of these systems at this point are to work out the kinks, get people in the system, work out the best way to kind of report and collect a mileage fee, and really kind of just collect information. Now in Virginia, I think they're actually probably are making a little bit of money because they have more enrollees, and I'll get into that in a moment. But once you'll see the rates are pretty similar, between 1 to 2 cents, and I'll go in a little more detail about a few of them. I do think it's important to talk about what vehicles are eligible. That's a big source of discussion in some of the states. I know in Utah they decided, like, no, we're just going with electric vehicles at this point in time. Whereas in Virginia, they actually allow fuel efficient vehicles into their systems. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But the important thing critically, of course, to talk about is collection methods. How do you actually report and collect these mileage fees? And that's a source of contention because you get into privacy concerns. Now, I would say that the advancements in the last couple of years have told us that technologically a RUC is possible. A RUC can be done. Is it as easy and as cost effective, especially in the short term, as a gas tax? No. Will it ever be? Perhaps not. Can we get to a point in the future where a RUC can be maybe getting closer? I think possibly so. And the reason is because in-vehicle technology, there's in-vehicle telematics that can automatically convey some of this information. There are smartphone apps, and you can take odometer photos and other things like that that can allow you to do this cheaper and more cost effectively than in the past. I will say that one trade-off that I always communicate to people is that there's a trade-off with the payment and privacy. If you don't have a GPS enabled system and you just have something like an odometer photo or something like that, that's great. You don't really have any privacy concerns, right? Then because you don't have something where you're reporting mileage and have something in your vehicle or what have you. But the trade-off is if you drive into another state or another country, you have no way to demonstrate that and make sure that you're not paying those miles for driving in another state, which is why I think cross-state partnerships and working with groups like the Eastern Transportation Coalition and other groups to do multi-state pilots are very important. So I want to talk about just very quickly about Virginia. Virginia has this mandatory highway use fee that they kind of constructed as like a semi-alternative to like an electric vehicle and like hybrid fee, but every vehicle in the state has to pay it. However, in Virginia, you can instead, once again, like I said before, you can enroll in the mileage use fee program, which is their RUC, instead of paying the required annual highway use fee. But critically in Virginia, they open that system to not only electric vehicles, but fuel efficient vehicles that get over 25 miles per gallon. And I'm going to come back to this because this is something I'm talk about kind of ad nauseum, is that the problem is not just electric vehicles. It is that vehicles are more fuel efficient. And while that is a great thing from an environmental perspective, it is not a good thing from a transportation funding perspective. And then I want to talk about Hawaii briefly. Hawaii has one thing where, a couple of things where they're very analogous to Vermont. And then, of course, one thing that is not. The first thing is that Hawaii is the first state to establish a mandatory RUC program. Beginning this program that will start in 2025 will become mandatory for electric vehicle owners in 2028. And Hawaii and I've long predicted that they were going to be the first state to do this because they have one critical advantage. You don't have any cross-state border traffic in Hawaii. You don't have to worry about driving in another state and doing that. So it's just inherently fairer and easier to administer. So they have one advantage over, kind of every state except for, Alaska in theory, but, Alaska does at least connect to other states. Now, the way they're similar to Vermont in that they're a small state, and also that Vermont is one of 4 states with an annual required vehicle safety inspection. That creates a very easy way to collect a RUC that is cost effective, that is unobtrusive, and that is just easy to administer. Now, once again, the drawback is that if someone drives out of state a lot, they're going to be paying their miles for driving in another state. And that's something where maybe a GPS, maybe you do offer a GPS system instead. But I did want to note that. And the long-term goal in Hawaii is to transition all vehicles in the state in Hawaii to a road usage charge. And I will mention the co-chair of a funding partnership that Representative Coffey served on is chaired by Senator Chris Lee from Hawaii, who has really been the mover and shaker behind making this happen in Hawaii. And I, of course, mentioned, and a lot of this is, we're not sure what's going to happen now, but the federal government has provided quite a bit of money for pilots, for road usage charges, but also for other kinds of alternative transportation user fees. And this map just demonstrates this. And I'll mention again that, really make sure to take advantage of the Eastern Transportation Coalition because they can help you kind of get together with the states in your region to think about how you can tackle things on a regional scale. So So with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to my colleague, Matt, and he's going to lead us through the rest of the presentation. So thank you very much and looking forward to any questions.
Thanks, Doug. I appreciate it. So nice to be here with you all. My name is Matt. I'm a transportation policy researcher with Doug, and I've been at NCSL for about a year and a half. I think I was lucky enough to catch some of you at our summit last year in Louisville. So hoping to see you all again in Boston in a couple months. So as Doug had mentioned, for this portion of the presentation, I'm just going to be covering a few other alternative transportation funding mechanisms. Jim, kudos to Jim. He also did a very good job of setting us up with a few of these. So we talked about per kilowatt hour charges, delivery fees, Uber Lyft fees, and a few other alternative mechanisms as well. So this first slide here, we're looking at per kilowatt hour charges. What this is pretty intuitive. Just as you would if you were going to Quick Trip, Shell, 7-Eleven to fill up your car and pay a gas tax, a per kilowatt hour charge is the equivalent for electric vehicles. You go to your public charging station, which again is public. This does not apply to private chargers or residency chargers. And you fill up your vehicle, and then you're assessed a fee on that amount that you fill up with to charge your car specifically. So right now there are 9 states that have these per kilowatt hour charging fees specifically, and they do dedicate significant portions or all of the revenue into transportation projects as well. You can see I have a few examples here on the screen. I want to focus on Pennsylvania here for a moment. So in Pennsylvania, they have a pretty low per kilowatt hour fee, just a little bit over 1 cent specifically. Interestingly, about a year ago, they actually had no distinction between private or public chargers. Pennsylvania originally tried to implement their fee on private chargers, but after running into some enforcement issues and administrative hurdles, actually amended their law to make it only applicable to public chargers and not assess a fee on the private chargers whatsoever. Through that study, and we actually reached out to administrators in Pennsylvania, they shared they generated about $1 million in their first year of implementing it on public chargers. And really the fee varies from state to state, right? You can see Utah's is pretty low. Maryland's is actually county to county, but also pretty low. A state like Iowa's is 2 cents. A state like Wisconsin is 3 cents. So everything's pretty much cents on the dollars for these per kilowatt hour charges. When you think about all these decisions, there's trade-offs associated with each one. Some of the benefits that come with a per kilowatt hour charge is that it's pretty easy for constituents to understand. It's pretty similar to a gas tax, right? It's only applicable to charging stations. But another benefit that Doug had mentioned just a little bit ago is when you have out-of-state EV motorists coming through Vermont from New Hampshire and New York, you can actually capture some revenue, right? They used Vermont's roads. And without a per kilowatt hour charge fee, they're essentially not contributing to the use of those roads specifically. So per kilowatt hour charge in the state does allow you the opportunity to get some revenue from out-of-state EV motorists as well. Doug, if I could go to the next slide, please. So these are Uber Lyft fees, transportation network company fees, better understood as Uber Lyft fees specifically. There are about 13 states that currently have Uber and Lyft fees. In addition to Washington, D.C. Pretty simple concept. You hail an Uber or Lyft with an app on your phone. You pay your fare for the service, but then you also pay a very small fee on top of that. In a state like Colorado, for example, it'll actually, when Uber or Lyft sends you its digital receipt, it'll actually just have a very plain and simple, straightforward section that will tell you point blank what that fee was specifically. And I do want to point out, too, there are 13 states here in this map you're seeing. I believe Jim had mentioned there was maybe 18, and we're both actually correct. Both Jim and Ashto and our count are both accurate. While there are 13 states that have a TNC fee or Uber Lyft fee, there's actually about 5 cities that specifically have them, not applicable to the state: Chicago, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Portland. There was a 5th city as well that's escaping me right now. But those are just citywide Uber Lyft fees, not statewide. While these here on your screen are statewide specifically. Of these 13 states here on the map, the ones highlighted red, 6 of them actually dedicate their revenue from these Uber Lyft fees into transportation funds specifically. It's important to note on these Uber Lyft fees that they do have separate rates based on a few specific situations. So in Colorado, for example, they've had their Uber Lyft fee for a couple years now. If you hail an Uber or Lyft that's an electric vehicle, it's about 15 cents per ride. If you hail a vehicle that has an internal combustible engine, it's actually a bit more. It's about 30 cents per ride. And Colorado does adjust those annually with inflation. Georgia, somewhat similarly, also has two different rates. In Georgia, as an individual, if you take an Uber or Lyft by yourself, it's 50 cents per trip. If you take a shared trip with multiple people, it's 25 cents per trip. So it's a little bit shorter as well. And they do dedicate all their revenue and funds to transit projects specifically. So as the next slide, we're actually talk about delivery fees, which was of special interest. So as Jim had mentioned, there are two states that currently have delivery fees. I know Vermont has introduced the legislation, which I believe is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it'd be 30 cents per delivery. I think that sounds about right.
Yeah, that's an S75.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so Vermont could become the third state. Colorado, Minnesota are really, these are the textbook examples of delivery fees. First two states to do it. And while they are the first two to do it, and there's a lot of similarities, it's really important to know how they're different. So Colorado has a 27-cent fee on all retail food deliveries at the point of sale. It's a catch-all, not very much distinction. Colorado does have an exemption for small businesses, and they do deposit all their fund into their highway users tax fund and a few other transit project goals. But Minnesota's is just tweaked slightly. So Minnesota has a 50-cent fee, so a bit higher than Colorado's, but it's actually only implemented if you have a deliveries over $100. And critically, that it has at least one taxable item within that delivery specifically. Minnesota actually has a lot of exemptions for their delivery fees, baby products, medical supplies, food ingredients, as well as a small business exemption as well. So Minnesota's is just a little bit more specific on when their delivery fee is applicable. In its first year, Colorado made just under $76 million from the delivery fee, so a pretty significant chunk of change. Minnesota is estimated to make about 60 million after its first year of implementation. And they do actually keep track of those things more specifically. And we'll see how much revenue they continue to generate off of that in the coming years as well. So Doug, if I could go to the next slide, please. So managed lanes. I feel like the best way to conceptualize a managed lane is a little bit different from just your traditional tolling lane. So tolling lanes could include private roads, right, that are only specific and any lane you use is tolled. A managed lane is a little different. There are about 11 states in the US that currently have managed lanes, and I believe 6 more are planning to implement managed lanes or choice lanes. And what a managed lane or a choice lane is essentially is you have moving in the same direction, existing as it is, 2 lanes of traffic. A decision gets made to create a managed lane or a choice lane. So you create a third lane. This is a new additional lane, and that third lane is the tolled road. So you have 2 non-tolled and now an optional third one. It's a choice lane. And essentially this comes with a time savings benefit for both motorists who opt to use that choice lane and for those who don't. The benefit's more clear for those who choose to use it. Obviously, you pay that toll lane, you move through traffic quicker. However, if you are a motorist who chooses not to use that toll lane, you benefit from that roadway becoming decongested over time. Another not so obvious benefit that we've seen at a state like Colorado, where I'm based at, is that your public transit system, like buses, will often use these choice lanes to also avoid traffic, but it also comes with a benefit of increasing efficiency and reliability for your public transport systems like buses as well. All these states dedicate a portion of the revenue from these managed lanes into the transportation funds and transportation projects. Tennessee, which is highlighted here in gold, which is the forthcoming state that's going to implement these, is the most recent example of creating these managed lanes, which was their first time ever doing something quite like it. They do dedicate all their funding into capital maintenance projects, and they also dedicate a portion into transit corridors to help offset traffic congestion in a few different ways as well. So if I could go to the next slide, Doug, please. This one I'm not going to spend too much time on. This is somewhat similar to the slide you saw earlier Doug showed that had all the bullet points. These were just a few examples I pulled out of there. Kind of a miscellaneous funding approach this slide. So just last year, New Jersey implemented a corporate transit fee where on businesses with a net income over $10 million, they created a small surtax, and then they dedicated that surtax money into transportation projects. And for each of their fiscal years, they're projected to make just a little over or around about $500 million from that specifically. Also, several years ago, Massachusetts took an interesting route where they created a ballot measure specifically asking constituents and voters if they wanted to improve an income tax, sometimes called the fair share tax or the millionaire tax. And basically, what this did was on a tiered system, any individual, this is not for corporations, who made their first $1 million is taxed at 5%. Anything over that first $1 million, into that $2 million range is taxed at 9%. And then that second tier, that 9% tax, actually gets adjusted and dispersed to half transportation goals and half public education goals. And in their first year of implementation, fiscal year 24, and then their following year, fiscal year 25, they also raised about $500 million for transportation projects. So pretty significant sums there. So that essentially wraps up this alternative transportation funding portion of the presentation. I will say everything Doug and I shared is also in NCSL resources, reports, projects, tracking databases. We have all this information available for all of you, so please utilize it. So you'll see here in this slide, we have some links. And I believe you all have this slide as well, so you can click and open these at your discretion to find these resources. And then, of course, as mentioned a few times, I know summer probably feels like it's a long way away. I'm sure Vermont has some snow right now. All of our snow just melted here in Colorado, but August, we'd love to see some Vermont representation or come to New England and Boston for our legislative summit, where we will be talking about transportation funding in a couple seminars, as well as every policy subject area under the sun, essentially. So next slide is our contact information, but we will be hanging out here for all the questions you may have.
Questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about the delivery fees in particular. So I'm in support of a delivery fee, obviously, seeing that I introduced the legislation on it. And there's no designated place that the revenue goes within the bill, although there are sections of it that look to fund electric vehicle incentives and kind of the more, I would say, climate change focused work that our state has endeavored to do. I'm wondering, in the other two states that have moved forward with delivery fees, have they, I think from your slides, it looked like they went just broadly to transportation and kind of making up the shortfall of revenue. Has there been any success? Has there been a policy or a revenue source that folks have directly tied to good climate change policy, or are we just in such dire straits nationally that people are just trying to fill in gaps with their own revenue shortfalls for roads and bridges?
Matt, I can speak to, and then you can weigh in. And we in Senator White, I am happy if you would like us to, we can connect you with the two bill sponsor from Colorado and Minnesota. You would like that? I'll send you an email with that, and I can CC the committee staff and Senator Westman. So actually in Colorado, the retail delivery fee, quite a bit of the money does go to some electric vehicle charging and kind of air quality provisions. I would say that is very unusual for the kind of dynamic that you express, Senator White, is that states find themselves in a position where there's such tension between some of the environmental and energy goals that states are trying to achieve and the transportation funding. And that's why one of the things I just say broadly is that, coordination with your with your colleagues that work on those committees of jurisdiction, probably some of which you sit on, is very important, because a lot of these approaches that have very admirable goals ended up working at cross purposes with things in terms of maintaining a safe transportation system. I'll try and think about any other states that kind of have dedicated any funding sources to climate change, but actually that the Colorado retail delivery fee is one of the main ones that I thought was very notable at the time, because it actually doesn't devote most money to like the traditional transportation trust fund. It is actually going to things like clean vehicle fleets and electric vehicle charging stations and other things like that. So Matt, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah, Colorado dedicates a portion of that. I don't know what portion off the top of my head, but to what they call the Clean Transit Enterprise Goals, which is that electrification and also switching state vehicles into electric vehicle models. So some of that does go to that specifically in Colorado.
And we can send you information on that formulaic breakdown, because I know I've seen that before somewhere center-wide, so we can send that to you.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. I really appreciate that the chair invited you to come to speak to this. I just have one overarching question, which I think I've been wrestling with, and I'd love to kind of hear how other states are dealing with it. But we do not have, even in Vermont, the political will to increase costs on the average person. And taxes and fees are the way that Vermonters are stressed about that, and they don't want to see an increased cost. So if we're not going to increase revenue, and we're not seeing revenue just appear and continue to grow as we expect, that would mean a decrease in the work that we're doing, a decrease in the projects, a decrease in the grants that we offer to municipalities, a decrease in work, and a restructuring potentially of the Agency of Transportation here. Like, that's unfortunately the really big conversation we're going to have if we're not with the political will to increase revenue. I'm wondering, are other states starting to dismantle or reduce their AOT budgets? And is that alternative being really considered in other states? And is anyone doing it effectively, where they're saying we're going to slowly but surely decrease how many roads we pave every year, or lower our expectations on quality of roads, or set the expectation that, hey, we can either raise this fee or we are not going to be paving the same amount? Like, how is that conversation playing out with people making the rational choice that we have less, so we're going to have to do less? And is that conversation happening?
That's a good question, Senator White. Yeah, that touches on a lot of dynamics. I mean, obviously, we said before, Matt and I try to, at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're representing and trying to serve state lawmakers. And we understand that you are elected officials and that there are political pressures. So we always want to be kind of aware and cognizant of that. I'm sure Jim has a lot of good thoughts on this. But what I would say from my end is that some states have been in that position for 10 or 20 years.
Yeah.
The problem, of course, is that if you and Jim is much more well-spoken on this, but if you let your road systems or your transportation systems go into a state of disrepair, you're making things more expensive for you in the long run, while also increasing costs to to your constituents, because of things like your hubcap coming off, your axle getting broken, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a difficult conversation. The one other thing I'll throw out there, and this is a little more difficult in a smaller state, is that, and this isn't a revenue increase, is that the use of P3s. You could potentially use P3s, public-private partnerships, as a project delivery method to potentially, if you do things right, more cost-effectively complete a project quicker and cheaper, and that frees up more money for you to use elsewhere. To be clear, that P3s do not create new revenue, though. They just are more cost-effective way potentially of doing something, and they're complicated, and a smaller state, frankly, is a little bit more of a disadvantage because you don't maybe have as many projects that are of interest to a P3 concessionaire. But I want to let Jim speak, chime in, because I think he probably has better insight on this question.
Yeah. So thank you, Doug. I would say that there are a handful of states that have dealt with this challenge and looked at their network of transportation facilities and had to make a decision: do they disinvest in some of them? And that takes a couple of different approaches. They could just say, look, this is a facility we're not going to invest with any longer, and let it essentially degrade. We usually see this on more rural facilities where maybe it's a paved road that they're going to let go to eventually be at a different standard, whether that turns to gravel or it's a different type of road. But also, we've seen transfer of ownership of some facilities and said, well, this is a state-owned facility. we don't have the revenue to keep it up the way it should, we'll transfer that facility from an ownership standpoint to a locality, to a county or to a city. So that's another area that there's been some discussion on within states where they've had the same challenges that you all are having, which is, the revenue isn't keeping up with the state of good repair needs that are out there. We've got to be able to target the revenue that we have to the facilities that need the investment. And you have to make a value judgment. Which of these facilities are the ones that need investment? Which are the ones that are having the most impact on people's quality of life? Which ones are having an impact on the state's economy? And make those decisions based on the revenue that you have at hand.
We don't have county government here.
We do, they're just extreme.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
The other thing I would say too is that it does, I think if you're in that kind of environment, the thing you have to be particularly clear-eyed about is and this may not be the case in Vermont, but like any discussion of expansion of capacity, new lane and road miles should be treated probably with a fair degree of skepticism if you're in that sort of situation. The last thing you arguably should be doing is adding more more facilities, more infrastructure that you have to maintain.
I would say to you that we're probably not looking at that. And we're, in some respects, all of you today painted a picture that is a little dark. And we're struggling like everyone else to maintain what we have. And all of the strategies we're going to need to look at to do this. You've been, all three of you, very helpful today, and I'm sure we'll be back in touch. And to the NCSL people, please send us your information, and we'll get some people appointed to your committees. And to the AASHTO, Jim, thank you so much. You were very helpful too. And I think we're past noon, and there are lots of people that have other meetings to go to, but you've been very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be in